Have you ever heard the phrase jog your memory? J-O-G, jog your memory. Well, Americans use that to talk about something that occurs that makes you remember. It jogs, it wakes up your memory. And there are a lot of things that can do it. In fact, in my life, I can think of things like smell. Laurel's mom used to make this amazing meal for every holiday and had a certain smell. I have 12, they had 12 grandkids and 2 granddaughters, poor girls. And anytime we smell any of that, it makes them think of Gran and Papa. It jogs their memory. Might be a song. I had an older brother I was really close to, and Van was a gifted guitar player, was kind of unusually gifted, and I can remember he died 2 years ago of West Nile disease, but every once in a while I hear a song that jogs my memory, and I have this flashback of my brother talking to me about playing guitar. It might be a location. Laurel and I took our honeymoon on an island off the coast of Florida when we got married, and they had this place on the beach that serves soup, clam chowder soup, and we would go there every morning and every evening to get it, and it was called the Mucky Duck. Now today it's all touristy and wasn't the same, but we went back a few years ago to celebrate our anniversary. But even still, just the sign jogged my memory, made me remember, oh yeah, here's all the great blessings that have come from God giving me a wife so excellent there. It might be an experience. I have recently reconnected with old grade school and junior high buddies, and we've been playing dominoes or whatever together, and when I get together with them, it jogs. It's like I'm back in junior high. I'm back in 6th grade. I can remember all these things because something jogged my memory. It might be an image you keep in your mind. Like I remember I'd planted a church called Heartland Community Church, and kind of at the pinnacle of our success, I guess, that God had given us, I preached about Moses at the burning bush and how God told him to remove his shoes because he was standing on holy ground. And I talked about the mission we had as a church to reach unchurched people, and that God had given us some sense of success in that mission, and that we were literally in that place standing on holy ground. I didn't plan this or anything, but all I remember is 1,000 people came up, took their shoes off, and put them on the stage as a way of saying, we do it again. And in fact, the best part was after the church service, I forgot to tell them, get your shoes. So people went out to lunch just wearing their socks. That image sticks with me and reminds me of all these things. There are all kinds of things that can jog your memory. But the point I want to talk about as we look at Joshua chapter 4, the first 7 verses today, is we all need memorials. We need something to jog our memory. Something that tells us about the significant things and the significant moments in our life. And we need those triggers. That's why this week's readings, if you've been reading in the AIM materials, and AIM is just something right now we're doing online devotionals studying through the book of Joshua. We've been through week 3, and so you're basically end of chapter 3 and most of chapter 4. And over again it talks about how Joshua sets up a memorial. He has the priests set up 12 stones at their camp to memorialize what happens that day. And Joshua himself puts 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan riverbed. And the reason why is that you and I are so prone to forget. We have spiritual amnesia. We forget very quickly who we are. And so here just in chapter 4, there are 3 separate memorials that are built. In verse 2, 12 tribes take a stone, a representative from each tribe. In verse 9, you can see Joshua himself gets his own pile of 12 stones. And in verse 20, you can see they build a memorial where they camp on the other side of the Jordan to help them remember that day they crossed on dry land under God's miraculous power. I want you to look at verse 7 when you get a chance, because it gives us the why. There in verse 7, it tells us that memorials remind us. They remind us. In fact, it even tells us in chapter 4 who it reminds. There's 3 groups it talks about. The first one is, it says, when your kids ask, it'll remind you to tell them the story. You might forget it. You might not remember it. And by the way, families that have memorials retell the stories about the important events of their lives. And if you want to pass faith on to your kids, you better start doing memorials, because it'll help your kids go like, oh yeah, this is real. This really happened to you. So the first group, Joshua says, is you build memorials so your kids will know. The second group, you can see this in verse 9, because he says to remind yourself. Memorials are not just to tell our kids. It's to remind ourselves, oh yeah, that happened. God did that for me. And then, interestingly, in chapter 4, verse 24, it tells us that it reminds the nations of who Israel's God was, what he has done in the past. So it has a purpose for our children, has a purpose for ourselves. It even has a purpose for the nations. And so our memorials, whether they be festivals or buildings or monuments or institutions like communion, they are so valuable in our faith for us, for our kids, and for the whole world to see, because we are so incredibly forgetful. I know I am. I remember years ago, I was teaching on a story that talked about learning to rejoice in your difficulties. I thought I had a pretty good message, but on the way to church early that morning, I got pulled over by a policeman and got a speeding ticket. And I can remember sitting there thinking like, God, I'm trying to do stuff for you. I can't believe you let me get a ticket and blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden I go, oh yeah, that I kind of forgot what I was just about to go preach about that morning. We are so forgetful. Now, if you think that's just you or me, you're wrong. It's universal. Humans are that forgetful. I want to read from Numbers chapter 11. It's a story in the Old Testament that, to me, illustrates this spiritual amnesia that you and I and everybody else suffers from. God has taken the Israelites as slaves out of Egypt under Moses' leadership. He's allowed them to cross on dry land. They get to the other side on the way to the promised land, and they start complaining. In fact, the Bible calls them the rabble. The rabble start complaining. Here's verse 4. The rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel began weeping and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our strength is all dried up, and there's nothing at all to eat but this manna. Manna was the food that God caused in the wilderness to drop from heaven so that they could be sustained. And they forgot all the things that God did in the Exodus. It wasn't very long ago. And they're already going like, man, do you remember the restaurants in Egypt? They were so good. Oh, remember the fish they had? Oh, that was great fish. I know we were slaves, and that's why we got it for free, but I really like those melons they fed us, and those cucumbers, and leeks, and onions, and garlic. And they start reminiscing because their spiritual amnesia kicked in, and they had forgotten already what God had done in their life. That's why God tells them to commemorate, to memorialize what they're doing, just like Joshua is doing here with the 12 stones, so that they will remember. And you can read about it in Exodus chapter 12. It tells us that during the Passover festival, a long-term memorial that commemorates Israel leaving as slaves and being freed to go into the promised land. In Exodus chapter 12, read particularly verse 14 through 17, they're told that it's to be a lasting ordinance. You keep doing this Passover celebration forever, because you will forget very, very quickly what God has done in your midst. So these 12 stones that Joshua and the priests and everybody sets up here in Joshua chapter 4, they're necessary because we're spiritually senile. By nature, we're spiritually senile. We can't remember. We got amnesia. And this is the job of the church. This is what we're supposed to be doing, QC. We're supposed to be memorializing the gospel for our people through sermons. In fact, I think myself, over the years, all the sermons I've taught, probably more than half the time, as I'm teaching the sermon, I go, oh yeah, I remember. Yeah, I remember this. It's not like I never knew it. I just forget it so quickly, spiritual amnesia. This is why we have services. The service is a regular way to remind us, at least we hope, every Sunday or whenever we can meet, that God has done these things in past history. He's done these things in our lives. He's done these things in our church. It's also why we do things like communion, because communion is important. If we don't do communion, again, we forget stuff really, really quickly. I know there's a danger. Too much memorial, if you spend too much time on that, you become ceremonial. In fact, the church becomes like a funeral home where you just show a bunch of old dead stuff. But I don't think that's our risk today. I think for most of us in the West, the risk is the opposite. That we spend so much time thinking about what God's supposed to be doing right now that we forget all the things He's done throughout salvation history. And that's the purpose of the Bible. That's the purpose of sermons. That's the purpose of gathering together. I know there are Christians who think, well, I don't need that. I don't really need to go to church. I go, yes, you do. You desperately need it because you're sick. You have spiritual amnesia. So you need to be together with brothers and sisters who can remind you and tell the stories again, ones you've already known, but to tell them again so that you will go, oh yeah, you're right. That's the church's job. We are that pile of 12 stones that reminds people of what Jesus said, what Jesus did, and to remind them that He's still that same Jesus today and will be in the future. That's why Jesus made such a fuss about instituting communion. Go back and read it. Jesus spends a lot of time setting up what is called a Passover meal that He can celebrate with His disciples shortly before His death. You think He'd be focused on what's about to happen with Him. He's about to take a beating, but instead, He's spending His time and energy putting together this memorial supper. We sometimes refer to as the Last Supper because He knows about our spiritual amnesia. He knows we will forget quickly. And so what does He do in communion? He takes something that's so common that you and I, most of us do it at least twice, 3, 4 times a day. We eat. So Jesus turned something ordinary, common to everyone, rich, poor, black, white, brown, yellow, Eastern, Western. It's totally universal. Everybody eats. And so Jesus takes it and He turns it into memorial. So He takes the bread and the cup and He says, these are memorial. These will help you remember. So whenever you come together and drink this cup, whenever you are together breaking this bread, I want you to remember my body broken for you, my blood spilled for you. What an amazingly simple symbol. You see, Jesus set up a pile of 12 stones for us. He commemorated His death and its meaning in the simplest everyday task of our lives. And He told them, do this in remembrance of me. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 23 through 26, where Paul says, I pass on to you that which the Lord passed on to me, and then he institutes the Lord's Supper. What does he say? As often as you do these things, remember me. By the way, that's why when people ask me, well, how often should we do communion? I go, as a big church thing, I don't know that it matters. We don't really have any clear instructions. But we do have clear instructions. Paul tells us that Jesus said, every time you eat, this is what you ought to do. Now, it's interesting. In the West, we often have this thing where we go, oh, who's going to pray before the meal and bless the food? Funny, I don't believe that food needs to be blessed. I believe it's already blessed by the Lord. It's what we do with it that changes whether it's a blessing or a curse. So I never think of it as, oh, we need to give the blessing on the food. But we should start thinking every time I drink the cup, every time I break the bread and eat it, I remember the Lord's death until he returns. As often as you do it. I need that reminder. By the way, I think the earliest description of the church in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 2, verse 42. I would have to say that has been one of the most important verses in my life. Acts 2:42. I don't even need to look at it to tell you what it says. Here's what it says. The early church was devoted. That's the word used. They were devoted. And it says basically 4 things they were devoted to. By the way, I think these 4 things would be my definition of what a New Testament church is. It's not, do they have a building? Do they have a budget? Do they have a pastor? None of those things are mentioned by Jesus, and none of them are modeled by Jesus. But these 4 things are things Jesus modeled and did, the early church modeled and did, and anywhere the churches existed throughout history, they do. So what are the 4? Number 1, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Now, that's why I'm so big on AIM. AIM is just an acronym that stands for Abide in Me, because in John 15 says if you don't learn to abide in me, you cannot bear fruit. And I go, yes, the apostles' teaching is a memorial. We declare it every week so we can remember. By the way, that's why we want to preach straight through the scriptures, because they're all memorializing what God has done. My happy thoughts, or some other preacher's happy thoughts, they may be good, they may be even consistent with the Bible, but they're not memorials. You can't open them up 10 years later and read them and go, oh yeah, good reminder, good reminder. So there's the first thing. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Number 2, it tells us they devoted themselves to the fellowship. The Greek word is koinonia. The gathering, the fellowship. That's why, even though right now, I get it, I understand why we have to do online church together, but don't you long for the day we can gather? There's something about church that requires a gathering. It requires that koinonia, that together fellowship. And because of that, by the way, if the door opens, so hope soon, and I get to come back to Kiskeya, one of the things we have to at least consider is what I would call decentralization. The idea that we have to get everybody to show up on the property there is not a biblical idea. It's not bad, it's just not biblical. We need to start probably decentralizing the church, where Kiskeya has an expression up in the mountains and down Lower Del Mar and in Petionville and wherever we can find it. And we may need to decentralize. Kiskeya may need to become a church of 20 or 30 little house churches who gather together, I hope, on the first Sunday of the month to be together and celebrate and memorialize Jesus' death and resurrection through communion. I don't know what that's going to look like, and I don't know, but I do know this. Where the church is growing globally right now, particularly Asia, China, and the Middle East, Iran and Iraq, guess what? Persecution is forcing them to decentralize. They don't have big meetings. They just have to meet in small groups, house to house, just like it says there in Acts chapter 2. They met house to house. Every day, by the way. They spent all this time being fellowship together. I don't know what that's going to look like. Pray with me that God leads us in that. All right, number 3 thing it says in Acts chapter 2 is they devoted themselves first to the apostles' teaching, second to the fellowship, but third to the breaking of bread. Now, it uses in the Greek a definite article. It's not to breaking bread together. It's the breaking of the bread. And I think most scholars would agree that what it's referring to is this memorial supper. They were devoted to doing that together. To say, we're going to make sure, if we don't do anything else, we remember the Lord's death until he returns. And so we're going to break bread together. In fact, Acts chapter 2 goes on to say they did this almost daily in one another's homes, every day, reminding each other, oh yeah, Jesus' body was broken, his blood was spilt, so that I might be the righteousness of Christ in God's eyes. The breaking of the bread. And then the 4th thing it says is they were devoted to prayer. Those are the 4. Apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayer. And, I don't know yet what we're going to do, but I have to say, I'm not sure that we're getting that right. I think at Kiskeya we need to take more seriously. I don't know what it looks like. I have a buddy who has a church here in America where he defines membership, not by I signed this or I give money or anything like that. He defines it by, are you willing to take a shift in prayer? They do 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week prayer. And they go, don't call yourself a member of this community if you're not willing to be devoted to prayer. And so they literally, when somebody says, I want to be a part of this church, he's like, okay, well, let's sign you up. What prayer shifts do you want? And some people take many and some people just take a little. I don't know what that should look like for us. Some of you probably do. But we need to be devoted to prayer if we're going to be a biblical church. Can you imagine if we made those 4 things our membership standards? You got to be studying the scriptures, whatever, daily. You got to be devoted to a small group, a fellowship of people that you see all the time. You got to be breaking bread in communion with the body of Christ, and you got to be devoted to prayer. I think that would make a difference, don't you? I think it would change things significantly. Okay, let me get back to the point Joshua chapter 4 is making. I've kind of taken a little tangent there. But all those things are memorials that help us remember. Today we want to just focus on the one, the breaking of bread. It is the memorial similar to the festivals and the stones set up in Joshua. So what does COVID communion look like? How do you do communion in a pandemic? It's interesting to note. Our next communion time, we've kind of been in the pattern of the first Sunday of the month, and I think let's just keep doing that until we come up with better stuff. And our next one is in a couple of weeks. It's on July 5th. July 5th. 2 weeks from this Sunday, today. And here's what I want you to do. You don't have to do it, but I'm asking you to consider doing it. I want you to find a Kiskeya Chapel partner, somebody that's part of the fellowship here. It'd be even better if it could be 4, 5, 6 people. It doesn't really matter, but a group of people that are part of the fellowship. And on that Sunday, the 5th, I want you to plan a communion meal together. And at that meal, I'm asking you don't have to, but I'm asking you to do these 4 things. Number 1, I want somebody in the group to cook the elements, to make the whatever you're going to drink, and the bread or the food, whatever you're going to eat. And by the way, we don't need to do little cracker wafers and thimbles. That's something the church did to make it easier. I mean a real deal meal. By the way, if you read 1 Corinthians 11, when Paul's talking about communion, he says, hey, don't come to communion and pig out. Eat a snack before you come. I think that what he's pointing to there is that it was a real meal. They gathered together for a real meal, and they remembered the Lord's death. So, number 1, I want you to have a real meal together and make it. Number 2, I want somebody, it doesn't matter who, to read Luke chapter 22, verse 17 through 19, Jesus' words of institution. And maybe somebody wants to share something about it, but at least read it out loud together. Number 3, I want you to pray together that Quisqueya Chapel would retain this memory of Jesus' sacrifice, of his body and blood, and what it means to us. And then number 4, again, this is not from the Bible, this is just something we think would be cool. Would you mind somebody grabbing your phone or something and videoing some of it and send it in so that maybe on the 12th we can show clips and we can see our fellowship all over the place, little groups of people breaking bread together. That would be awesome. Now one day, soon I hope, Laurel and I will get to be back with you. Don't you long for that? I long for the day that we get to be back and share the Lord's Supper together under one roof. I want to do memory practice together because I got bad amnesia. So let's pray that God opens that door and that somehow Quisqueya Chapel gets to celebrate that together. The early church was so committed to that they literally, even under persecution, they built secret, they called them crypts, underground places where they could gather the Christians in the city to celebrate communion together. Many, many people died because they were willing to die so they could go down into that crypt and share the Lord's Supper together. Let's pray that God does that. Amen.